si tu as le temps et si tu veux bien,
Oui,
on pourrait peut-être envisager le mois de mai,
avec plaisir. Oui, oui.
parce qu'il fait très beau.
Oui, d'accord,
Tu peux même te baigner.
d'accord,
C'est-à-dire, vraiment, il fait vraiment beau, hein.
d'accord,
Et parfois, il fait froid, mais normalement, il fait très beau.
d'accord.
Ensoleillé, et comme
Oui,
il n'est pas encore trop chaud quand même,
oui,
c'est vraiment le moment agréable. C'est-à-dire, le mois de mai, fin avril, c'est
oui,
vraiment les temps préférés. Surtout si tu vas à la montagne.
oui,
Normalement, il fait
oui.
vraiment un temps excellent.
Mhm.
Voilà, il y a mes étudiants commencent lentement.
À arriver, d'accord,
Ouais,
d'accord,
et ça leur prend au moins une quinzaine de minutes comme ça. Tu vois.
d'accord,
Ils
d'accord,
sont lents.
d'accord, il n'y a pas de problème.
Ils
Non, non,
suivent,
mais
mais
non, non, ça serait avec plaisir. Puis l'idée, c'est aussi un peu d'explorer les possibilités de coopération en
voilà.
histoire maritime. Et, tu vois, enfin, c'est un projet qui peut continuer, enfin, qui a
Oui,
du
tout à
sens. Mm,
fait.
mm.
Parce que c'est nous, précisément. Maintenant, surtout, avec, tu sais que le port du Pirée
Oui,
est maintenant
chinois.
on mène, oui,
Oui,
je
oui,
ne me rappelle pas maintenant le
mm,
nom de la compagnie chinoise.
oui. Je crois que c'est Costco.
Bah voilà, Costco, voilà, c'est ça.
Costco, oui.
Et
Costco, c'est la
donc,
plus grosse compagnie chinoise de porte-conteneurs. Oui.
ouais, voilà. Et donc, et ça pose, enfin, pour les Grecs, c'est intéressant, parce que
Mhm.
pratiquement l'économie grecque tourne en partie autour de la marine marchande.
Oui,
Et si jamais il y a une belt, comment ça s'appelle? Un Silk
oui,
Road,
oui.
la route de la soie
Mhm.
euh, terrestre,
Mm.
ça ne convient pas du tout à des amateurs grecs, hein.
Oui, oui.
Donc, je me demande comment on peut envisager. C'est-à-dire, quels seront les développements des 20 années
Mm.
à venir.
Mm,
Parce qu'en plus,
mm.
l'économie grecque tourne aussi beaucoup sur les raffineries.
Oui,
Donc, on importe
oui, du pétrole brut, oui,
du
qui est
pétrole
raffiné
brut
en Grèce.
arabe
Oui,
ou
oui,
peut-être russe pour la
oui,
réexporter
oui,
une fois raffiné. Et là,
oui, oui.
avec tous ces développements d'Inde,
Mm.
etc., ça pourrait être un grand problème pour l'économie grecque.
Oui, oui. Et puis les Chinois sont également dans le port de Haïfa. Tu
Ouais.
sais, bon, alors, ils ne sont pas propriétaires du port, mais ils interviennent beaucoup dans la gestion. Donc, pour les Israéliens, c'est une opération intéressante sur le plan, comment dire, financier. Pour les Américains, ils regardent ça avec beaucoup d'attention parce qu'il y a la sixième flotte qui est aussi en Méditerranée. Donc, il y a des enjeux, on va dire, économiques et géopolitiques. Et ça
Ouais,
pourrait
ouais.
être, ça pourrait être une façon aussi d'étudier un peu les croisements de la stratégie chinoise en Méditerranée avec le Pirée, avec Haïfa, avec certainement d'autres points d'appui hein, aussi, qui sont très, très puissants et très implantés en Algérie. Mm.
Ah ouais, ça, c'est pas. Oui,
Oui.
c'est
Oui.
c'est normal.
Oui, ils sont très implantés en Afrique, mais ils sont beaucoup en Algérie dans le commerce de détail, dans le pétrole, dans des tas voilà. Et tout ça, ça a des répercussions aussi quand il y a des votes aux Nations Unies. Enfin, il y a des enjeux qui sont pas seulement économiques, quoi, qui sont aussi diplomatiques et géopolitiques. Oui.
Oui, oui, tout à fait. Mais surtout, l'Algérie avec son gaz naturel
Mm.
et toute cette histoire avec le Maroc, ça devient,
Oui,
c'est, enfin, ça bouge.
oui, tout à fait. Oui.
Donc, on attend encore quelques
Oui.
dizaines de minutes.
Il y a ça, tu sais, puis il y a un projet aussi dont je voulais te parler, enfin je ne sais pas si on en a parlé la dernière fois, mais Je suis impliqué dans une recherche avec des universitaires italiens et de Hollande sur l'histoire de l'assurance maritime.
Hmm.
Et donc,
Ça, ça pourrait
on a eu...
intéresser mon collègue
Oui,
Jaime Khalaftis, qui est un
oui,
spécialiste de l'histoire maritime. Oui,
d'accord.
ça aurait pu les intéresser beaucoup. Moi, je ne suis pas du tout spécialiste du
Hmm,
droit
hmm, hmm.
commercial, c'est-à-dire, j'y
Oui,
connais un tout petit peu.
oui,
Mais je pense que pour ce qui concerne les... Oui, parce qu'en fait, c'est qu'on ne connaît pas, mais qu'on ne connaît pas,
hmm,
c'est qu'à grande partie, pendant les guerres napoléoniennes,
hmm,
ou les guerres de la Révolution, disons,
hmm.
pendant donc la période où il y avait le blocus continental et le
Oui,
blocus maritime,
oui,
donc les bateaux grecs étaient neutres, enfin,
hmm,
grecs ottomans, étaient
oui,
neutres, donc ils voyageaient pas mal, ils ont même arrivé jusqu'à Montevideo,
mhm,
mais il paraît que pour faire face à des questions d'assurance
oui,
et de financement,
hmm,
ils avaient besoin des marchands, enfin des négociants
oui,
financiers comme les Grimaldi à
mhm,
Gênes
oui,
et probablement à Paris aussi.
d'accord.
Parce qu'il y a des gens qui sont à Paris, font la
Hmm,
connaissance des corails, ce sont des
hmm,
matelots.
mhm,
Pour une raison ou pour une autre, se sont allés de Marseille à Paris pour
oui,
passer le temps jusqu'au moment où l'argent arrive
oui,
et qu'ils retournent dans leur île d'origine. Donc, il paraît qu'il y avait quand même, ce qu'on ignore totalement comment elle fonctionnait, qu'il y
hmm,
avait des courroies, des,
oui, oui,
des financiers,
oui,
d'assurance. Et là, on connaît, enfin, on sait que c'était comme ça,
mhm,
mais les informations sont vraiment très éparses
mhm,
et qu'il est difficile de comprendre vraiment comment elle
hmm,
marchait. Mais j'ai l'impression que là, c'est vraiment, c'est-à-dire, pour faire du commerce maritime
hmm,
à la Méditerranée occidentale,
hmm,
probablement il aurait fallu passer par la coopération
hmm,
avec des financiers génois
oui,
qui
oui,
étaient
oui,
aussi actifs
mhm,
en France, j'imagine,
oui,
ou même à Livorno.
hmm,
Enfin, je connais mal. Ce sont maintenant, il y a des étudiants à nous qui préparent
oui,
leur thèse,
oui,
donc qui touchent à ce type de problèmes de
mhm,
financement,
oui,
d'assurance,
oui,
de, de, de la façon dont ils financent aussi bien la construction et l'achat de la navire,
oui,
l'armature de la navire
oui,
et les différents affaires commerciales
hmm,
qu'on fait avec les navires.
hmm, hmm,
Ce
hmm,
sont, ce sont en quelque sorte, ce sont des trucs différents, ce sont
hmm,
des activités, disons,
oui,
séparées.
distinct, oui, oui,
Et
oui,
donc, dans chaque activité, il y a d'autres participants
oui,
avec des types de relations différents. Donc,
mhm,
parfois, les mêmes personnes sont associées de diverses manières,
oui,
avec de diverses parts, etc. Et
mhm,
ça, c'est très compliqué. On connaît que ça existe, mais c'est
hmm,
jamais clair. Parce
hmm,
qu'il y en a qui ont des informations concernant non pas les faits lui-même,
hmm,
mais surtout certaines circonstances autour de ce type d'activité.
oui,
Donc, on
oui,
connaît qu'il est là. Et je me
mhm,
demande s'il y a comment dirais-je, des, 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 des- des, procédures équivalentes ou
oh,
comparatives
oui, oui,
pour l'espace asiatique.
oui, 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 c'est un sujet très intéressant, oui, oui,
Parce que les Grecs ne sont jamais allés plus loin que l'Arabie, je crois.
Oui.
jusqu'au 18e.
Mhm.
Même 19e.
Oui.
C'est vraiment le 20e siècle où ils vont régulièrement partout dans le monde.
Oui.
Sinon, avant les 19e, avant le 20e siècle,
Mhm.
c'était vraiment plutôt le monde atlantique, la
Mhm.
Méditerranée, le monde moyen-orientaux,
Mhm.
mais qu'est-ce que ça, hein? Donc, oui, un effort de comparer les espaces maritimes asiatiques,
Oui.
les
Oui.
espaces maritimes qui ne sont pas seulement méditerranéens, parce qu'ils occupent aussi
Mhm.
la mer Noire et la
Oui.
mer Rouge, le
Oui.
golfe arabe. Et ça doit être très intéressant parce qu'il
Oui.
faut des interfaces pour faire la
Oui.
liaison entre les deux, surtout entre
Oui.
l'Inde et le Moyen-Orient.
Oui.
Là, et je connais très mal.
Mhm.
Je pense d'ailleurs que je n'ai vraiment pas fait des études.
Mhm.
Je ne sais pas si Jelina est en train de retourner chez elle. Et donc, une fois
Mhm.
qu'elle est là, elle
Mhm.
va probablement nous expliquer comment ça marche.
Mhm.
Euh, je vais parler en grec. Να
D'accord.
πω ότι περιμένουμε να έρθουν και άλλοι παιδιά, ότι μιλάω γαλλικά. Εντάξει, φυσικά η δάξη θα γίνει στα αγγλικά, έτσι. Οπότε περιμένουμε και μόλις γίνουμε περισσότεροι θα ξεκινήσουμε. Βλέπω ότι δεν έχετε λάμψη για τις παρουσίες σας περισσότεροι. Ας πάω όλα καλά.
Χαρά, εσείς.
Πολύ καλά. Ελπίζω να προχωράει το γράψιμο.
Δεν πάει πολύ καλά, για να είμαι ειλικρινής.
Θα πρέπει κάποια στιγμή και μετά να το...
Λέω τώρα που μπήκε καινούργια χρονιά, καινούργια ψυχολογία, μπορεί να πάει λίγο καλύτερα, ελπίζω.
Ναι, νομίζω ότι είναι απόλυτα απαραίτητο να γίνει αυτό.
Ναι, και εγώ το πιστεύω, αλλά άλλο τι πιστεύει κανείς και άλλο τι κάνει στην πράξη.
Εντάξει, θα το καταφέρουμε, δεν υπάρχει θέμα. Donc voilà, François, je pense que comme ça, je ne sais pas si au moment où tu viens en mois de mai, par exemple, on discute surtout comme ça. Il faut parler avec Céline sur l'aspect comparatif entre les mondes méditerranéens, entre guillemets,
Oui.
les mondes de la Méditerranée orientale, plus
Oui.
mer Noire, mer Rouge,
Oui.
et votre monde asiatique,
Mhm.
qui va, bien sûr, je vois que, Kalimera Nico, je vois que ton monde asiatique, ce n'est pas l'espace de l'océan Indien, n'est-ce pas?
Non, non, c'est mer de Chine du Sud, c'est mer de Chine orientale, et ensuite c'est tout l'espace maritime de l'Asie du Sud-Est. Tu le vois sur la première carte.
Oh, ouais. Mais
Voilà.
c'est-à-dire que le monde indien était à part, en quelque sorte.
Oui. Bon, il y a des contacts par Malacca, parce que des marchands indiens sont arrivés à Malacca, mais comment dire, ma présentation, elle est centrée surtout sur le mer de Chine du Sud et l'espace Asie du Sud-Est. Voilà.
Ah, voilà, Jelena Harloftis. She's our director. Okay. So we'll switch in English. She's better in English than in French.
Yeah.
Elle est plus charmante en français, mais elle préfère l'anglais.
D'accord.
Jelena, good morning. We're talking with François, saying that probably if he is able to come in May, we could try to discuss comparatively the world of the Eastern Mediterranean plus Red and Black Sea compared to what he will present to us today, the world of East Asia, Southeast Asia, and see if we can think comparatively and make something like a liaison, a link between the two. I
Definitely.
hope.
We would be delighted to have you.
And
also
we were saying
person.
that you would very much interested to see information on assurance, asfalia, maritime, assurance maritime. I don't know the English expression.
It's
Insurance.
maritime insurance, yeah.
Yeah, maritime insurance. Because we know I know very little about it. I was saying that. And I think that we know very little about it. And maybe it would be a good idea to see if we could put our expertise together and see to what extent we can think of that comparatively. Because it's a period that 16th, 17th to 20th century that it's important for us as well.
Definitely.
So I think we can begin because it's already 16 past 4. And I'm very glad to have with us emeritus researcher and professor François Poulou of the CNRS, the Centre, the French Research National Research Center, and he's a well-known specialist of East Asia in early and contemporary modern period. He will give us today a talk on maritime trade and its impact on China's economic development from the 16th to the 18th century. And I will be ready to upload and share with you his maps. So, Francois, thank you very much for being with us. And you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Socrates. I'm very glad to be with you today and to share this view on maritime trade, the impact it had on China's economic development. And the period I'm focusing on is from the 16th to the 18th century. Roughly speaking, it's the end of the Ming dynasty and the beginning of the Qing dynasty, the Manchu dynasty. So let me begin by saying that on 2 occasions in the second millennium, Chinese maritime power was deployed in Asia in the 15th century. First, you have heard of the maritime expeditions of Admiral Cheng He, and these expeditions were not only commercial or explorative, but it was mainly diplomatic and military adventures. And for the second time, in the 16th to the 18th century, it was then in a complete different context, which was characterized by the preponderance of trade or piracy. We will see that in a few moments, and the repeated interactions with foreign merchants, because at that time we had Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch operating in Asian seas. Therefore, maritime trade during the late Ming was characterized by the intermingling of tributary trade, and I will come back on this idea in a few moments, private trade and piracy. The establishment of the ban on maritime trade gave way to a scarcity of goods entering China and to a great profitability of smuggling activities. But while the ban on maritime trade never succeeded in eliminating the so-called Japanese pirates, it opened the possibilities of huge profits to illegal trade. And the Fujian coast of China, in the southeastern part of the country, offered many opportunities to smugglers. Maritime trade was a very lucrative, although high-risk and capital-intensive business, where the various forms taken by maritime trade, proto-companies, the Chinese equivalent of the partnerships that appeared in Europe in the late medieval period, This is the first question. And what has been its impact on a huge continental empire? So my presentation will trace the evolution of partnerships in maritime trade through the analysis of several lawsuits lodged against merchants who defied the ban on maritime activities in the 17th century to engage in trade with Japan and Southeast Asian countries. We have always thought of the world, or more precisely, international relations and the economy in terms of nation states. But this conceptual division, born with the Treaty of Westphalia in the middle of the 17th century, is convenient because it gives an image of the world divided into sovereign states with clearly defined borders. But this was not always the case. In the 14th century, as you know, Genoa, Venice, or Barcelona, for example, were global centers commanding world flows with their control over central maritime area of the time, the Mediterranean. Later, Lübeck, Hamburg, and Riga were at the center of another maritime space that also structured global flows, the Baltic Sea and the Hanseatic League. Finally, the South China Sea, thanks to the superposition of Arab, Indian, Portuguese, and Chinese networks, was one of the key poles of trade between Asia and Europe from the 16th to the 18th century. In other words, commercial exchanges, the circulation of technical knowledge, and religious beliefs were organized around maritime basins, supported by port metropolises, and defined, thanks to flows, spaces without borders. To better understand the scope of the analogy, let's return to the concept of the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is not only about geography or history. It also designates cities without a state, armed force without a centralizing power, wealth created or transported without a unified tax levy system. In Brodel's analysis of the Mediterranean, borders are porous, space is defined by flows, and different temporalities telescope each other. Brodel thus breaks down the dichotomy between center and periphery, opens up borders, and underlines the fluidity of geographical divisions based solely on a political division of the world. Therefore, it seems relevant to me to make a reading of the concept of the Mediterranean that is not geographical nor limited to a historical reality, but institutional. The concept of the Mediterranean as a polycentric urban system is first of all a metaphor which shows and helps us to understand the functioning of economic systems preceding the advent of the nation state at a particular moment, which is that of the first globalization. The Mediterranean is therefore a heuristic instrument with 5 characteristics in my view. First, Genoa and Venice built their autonomy during the medieval period by playing on their particular position at the crossroads of several distinct and competing jurisdictions. Second, their naval power operates to secure maritime spaces without territorial ambitions. Third, the concept of the Mediterranean defines space in terms of flows, networks, nodal points, and not in terms of territories. This hierarchy is fluid. The management of trade flows is more important to them than the control of territories and the taxation of the people. Fourth, the maritime metropolis actively contributed to the creation of original legal instruments that were developed outside the state framework. The proliferation of international commercial law, which originated in maritime private law, can be placed in the more general framework of the lex mercatoria in the Middle Ages. Fifth, the Mediterranean is also a metaphor for understanding the birth of capitalism. Indeed, very early on, the legal responsibilities of the fund provider and the liabilities of the operator were clearly distinguished in the maritime trade of Italian cities. This legal clarification has multiple implications. The entrepreneur risks his capital, he is responsible for it. It is also a kind of what we could call popular capital, where the shares were distributed among thousands of hands and were regularly exchanged. Let's now turn to Asia. Let us reverse our perspective for a moment and consider the map of Asia no longer from the large continental masses of China or India, but from a maritime space that links the different regions. If Socrates, if we can see the map number 1 now, it could be useful. I don't know if you have, yes, that's the first map. So what we see is a land-sea continuum in which the ports are not only the drainage points for goods produced in the hinterland, but also and above all, the starting point for an extremely dense network of trade flows. From the 16th to the 18th century, the Yellow Sea, and in the northern part of the upper part of this map, the South China Sea in the center, and the Celeb Sea and the Bay of Bengal formed a chain of interconnected sea basins. From the Sea of Japan in the north to the Straits of Malacca in the south, from Coromandel Coast and Ceylon to the Persian Gulf and to the Red Sea, a continuum of trade zones was linked by networks of Chinese, Japanese, Indian, and Arab merchants, and from the 17th century onwards, by Europeans. A string of port metropolises served as a base for communities whose economic power was deployed without the support of the state. This immense maritime region prospered outside the limits of imperial jurisdiction, and several port cities, for instance, Nagasaki in the south of Japan, Canton in southern China, Macau near Canton, Sakai in Japan, or later on Manila in the Philippines and Batavia, created by the Dutch in the 17th century, were to assert themselves as the real centers of accumulation of wealth and knowledge. The influence of this maritime space expanded or contracted according to the power or weakness of the merchant networks that crisscrossed it. Would it be relevant to term it an Asian Mediterranean? Does the concept of Mediterranean open up relevant angles of view for understanding the economic and geopolitical issues of maritime Asia during late imperial period? Let's return for a moment on the point I've made earlier. Transnational maritime space thrive because of their location on the edge of competing jurisdictions. In order to define the connection between place and network, the French geographer Jean Gottman has used the concept of hinge in a variety of forms. He spoke of a hinge place or region, a historical hinge, a multiple hinge, etc. For instance, he defined Constantinopolis as a hinge between capital and empire, between Europe and Asia, between Romans and Greeks, between land power and sea power. Gottman's concept loses none of its relevance or topicality if we consider the Asian maritime space. For more than a century, Hong Kong has been at the junction of two maritime basins, the East China Sea and the South China Sea. For several decades, It also constituted an interface between the Anglo-Saxon legal world and the Chinese planned economy. Singapore or Malacca are located at the edge of two other maritime basins, the South China Sea and the Bay of Bengal. Within these maritime areas, we can also note the articulation in a sophisticated network of high seas trade and coastal shipping. Finally, we can note the articulation between tributary trade and private trade, which dominated the maritime space of East Asia from the 12th to the 17th or even 18th century. Who are the operators dominating these maritime areas? Merchant diasporas and anthropocities are the two co-structuring elements of the Asian maritime system. In the case of China, the great Chinese historian Fu Yiling outlined a typology of merchants involved in overseas trade. He identified first those with power, land, or capital, those enjoying, in other words, a strong political influence. The second category is large local families, be it military or landowners. And the third category is merchant officials, or officials who throw themselves into the business. But among the actors of maritime trade, we can also distinguish more refined categories: ship owners, traders, charterers, financiers, pawnbrokers, and so on, to which one must add the crowd of small merchants embarking on a maritime expedition. Considering the geographical affiliations, the ultramarine trade is animated in Asia by a large merchant network: merchants of Canton, merchants of Fujian, and finally the merchants of Zhejiang, three provinces in southeast part of Chinese Empire. The Fujianese, which is the province just in front of Taiwan, engage in distant trade from points that not their home bases. This undeniably evokes a Mediterranean pattern of trade between Manila, the capital of Philippines, Batavia in the Dutch Indies, Nagasaki in Japan, Taiwan. I remind that it has been under Chinese control only at the beginning of the Qing dynasty. And finally, Macau with the Portuguese management, or Phai Pho in Vietnamese coast, or Malacca in Malaysia. All of these driven by a network with strong regional and linguistic affiliations. The large port cities were both a support point for external operation and a nodal point towards which these merchant networks converged. The comparison with Europe in the medieval period is again enlightening in my view. From the 11th to the 14th century, a unique phenomenon occurred in Europe. The tax levied by a centralized administrative structure disappeared, and yet the population increased, rich and powerful cities appeared outside the constraint of a central state. However, the cities that were born without a state between the 10th and the 13th centuries in Europe were also a place where private international law was developed, where civil society flourished, and where the political ambitions of the patrician families got stronger. Such a matrix, in a context of political fragmentation, proved favorable for the development of business. St. Augustine says it very explicitly: the city is non muri sed mentes, a state of mind rather a structure. In the 12th century, a Spanish rabbi, Benjamin of Tudela, left a diary of his travels in Europe, Western Asia, and Africa. About Italy, he observed that The nobles did not live in castles, but in cities. He describes a country structured by these cities whose people govern themselves. I quote, "The Italians have neither king nor prince to govern them, but only judges whom they appoint themselves, the consuls." What about Asia? In Southeast Asia in particular, the fragmentation of political power encouraged the establishment of Indian, Chinese, Burmese, and Siamese merchant diasporas. In the great ports of Northwest India, Surat, the Persian Gulf, Aden, and East Africa, Mombasa, Europeans were rarely able to eclipse the commercial diasporas originating from Southeast Asia before the industrial age. The model is Malacca, physical protection of foreign merchants in exchange for fiscal resources and wealth inflows. What is at stake in Asia around displaced communities, marginal in their societies of origin, Jewish or Marano merchants, Armenian or Parsi traders, does not correspond exactly to what the history of European expansion has taught us. A linear development driven by the intrinsic dynamism of Western society. The society created in Asia from these cosmopolitan networks is neither Europe nor Asia, but a world apart with its own customs, its own way of selecting elites, etc. The relations between the city and the state, between network and the hierarchy, are played out in China in a singular political context, that of the imperial structure, about which I would like to say a few words now. The study of empires as a specific political, economic, and social formation has, in recent years, renewed our understanding of the economy and politics. It has also proved to be a relevant tool for comparing socio-economic formations that are too often studied in their intrinsic totality and endogenous dynamics, and not in their interconnections. Particularly interesting in this approach are the questions of the role of violence, peacekeeping, wealth creation, the role of the state, or of a centralized administration. How does the logic of empires unfold? In the case of China, let me focus on two of its characteristics. First, the imperial structure accommodated a fuzzy conception of sovereignty, which also partly overlaps with what we could call today soft power. Second, the imperial structure accepted borders that in reality were more marked by a cultural difference or by differences between commercial institutions prevailing in a given economic space than by geographical roots. The Chinese tributary trade is an eloquent illustration of this imperial logic. During the first period of the Ming Dynasty, in the 14th and 15th century, foreign trade lost its economic dimension and became only a part of the political activities of the imperial administration. Tributary trade, the only legal form of foreign trade, was monopolized by the court. The items to be traded and their prices were determined by the administration. Giving permission for tributary trade became a means of political pressure towards foreign countries. Foreign products imported by tributary missions were exempt from taxes. This political and diplomatic dimension is explicitly reflected in the instructions given by the ministers of finance. I quote, "Pay them," the foreigners, "pay them several times the price offered so as not to lose their affection and always give them more than you receive, unquote. So you can see and understand that tributary trade was at loss for the Chinese Empire. During the reign of Emperor Hongzhi, at the end of the 15th century, the Grand Secretary recognized that the government did not make a profit from tributary trade. I quote, "It is not for profit that the government should levy taxes on the activities of foreign merchants. They are attracted by our morality and uprightness, not by profit. It would be shameful for us to make a profit on trade with them. Even if we levy taxes on their activities, they must be small. We lose more dignity than profit," unquote. But in the 16th century, a private trade also developed, often involving piracy. It was based on Quanzhou, a port situated on the edge of the provincial power of Fujian. It became the starting point for their trade with Taiwan, the Ryukyu, today Okinawa, in the southern part of Japan, and Japan, especially as a myriad of small islands in the bay offered countless hiding places. The great coordinator, Zhu Wan, writes, and I quote, "The inhabitants of Anpinggang, of Quanzhou, of Yuegang and Haotsang, and Meiling and Jiawan live by the sea and draw their strength from it. They gather in large numbers and rebel. They are vicious and arrogant people. If you are lenient, they will stay at home. If you are harsh, they will take to the sea." In 1633, the Chinese Admiral Zheng Zhelong, who had defeated the Dutch at Tianmen, made Quanzhou his headquarters and, as the head of Fujian Navy, embarked on intense trade with Japan. Zheng Zhelong set up an elaborate trade organization consisting of 5 groups of merchants operating on the mainland in Fujian, Hangzhou, and the surrounding areas. They advanced funds for the purchase of products to be exported and entrusted this shipment to specialized merchants. The latter would receive the goods in Xiamen, load them, and sell them abroad, repaying the advance on their return. In Fujian, during the Ming period, one could be a fisherman, a salt producer, a soldier, a merchant, a smuggler, or a pirate. A typology of merchants must take into account these 3 main components. First, as I mentioned before, the great merchants. Second, the pirates. And third, the Chinese merchants established abroad, the overseas communities in Japan and Southeast Asia. The first category is that of wealthy entrepreneurs who are the capital providers. They came from the class of rural landowners or the local administration. They have a large amounts of capital, and they were very familiar with fiscal policy and often had trading license. They lent to the crowd of small merchants, hawkers of the sea. The latter also sometimes became the agent of the big investors whose debtors they were. Maritime Asia is not only crisscrossed by merchants, it is also the realm of smugglers and pirates, as I mentioned before. The line separating these activities is indeed very thin. Piracy is nothing more than the repeated and violent challenge to the state's monopoly on trade and its level of taxation. In 1655, the ban on maritime trade led to the collapse of trade with Batavia. But the Chinese maritime trade fell into the hands of Zheng Chenggong, better known under his Romanized name Koxinga, a pirate who controlled much of the maritime trade between Fujian and Taiwan, between Fujian and Japan and Southeast Asia. This dynamism of the periphery unfolds in a very particular historical context. The years 1640 to 1680 mark a pivotal period for China. It was the transition between two dynastic regimes. The Manchu reconquest was not completed until 1685 with the fall of Taiwan and the last bastions that remained loyal to the Ming on the mainland. The pirates operating in China's Sea during Koxinga's time were capable of sustained operation, but this was because they were in a maritime domain where they reigned supreme, thanks to their control of the resources and the taxes they levied on local populations. If we can see now the second map, which is map 2, you will see the.
Can you see it now?
The map number 2.
Yes, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect, thank you. So in brown, you have the zones under the military control of Zhengzhenggong of Koxinga, and you can see that most of the southeastern part of China is under his jurisdiction. Such a situation, I mean, the Ming-Qing transition with his civil war also encouraged immigration, which fed a powerful trading network in Southeast Asia. Chinese merchants firmly established in Siam, Annam, today Vietnam, Tonkin, northern part of Vietnam, the Malay Peninsula, Brunei, Java, Borneo, and in Japan, I mentioned Nagasaki before. Acting as interpreters for the local courts, they were indispensable intermediaries in the organization of tributary trade and private trade with China. Before being supplanted by the Canton Hongs, the Canton merchants, which were the unique interface between foreigners and imperial administration, the trading house that acted as intermediaries for foreign traders, Fujian merchants had the upper hand in overseas markets in Japan and Southeast Asia. The bulk of the transactions involved fruit, timber, sugarcane, rami, indigo, paper, books, etc. But there were also more luxurious products, which were silk woven in Quanzhou or in Zhangzhou. The prosperity of the Fujian merchant depended on their ability to mobilize distribution channels for the goods they had organized in the province itself and in the neighboring province of Zhejiang. This meant that they needed strong connections with the local bureaucracy and the large administrative, land-owning, and military family. They also had to set up a chain of warehouses and buying stations for products in high demand abroad. These warehouses were also used to store contraband from abroad. Let's now look at the forms taken by their commercial expeditions. We have different forms of associations, and we will look at their evolution too. First form was the agency. Agency was a special feature in the case of maritime trade. It was a relationship of personal dependence that was not based on any contractual agreement. A typical case was adopted children who were raised by wealthy merchants before being sent overseas to trade. This was a common practice in Fujian province. The children, when grown up, were given capital and shipped off to trade on behalf of their parents. The Zheng clan, the Koxinga clan I mentioned before, frequently used this arrangement. Members of the gentry were part of Koxinga's trading network, and adopted children were often their agents. Adopted children were not always confined to menial roles. They can also play very important responsibilities. But another category of agents consisted of independent merchants bound by long-term obligations, for instance, debt or chartered ships they borrowed to trade on behalf of the Koxinga network. The profits they made from these operations were used to pay the interest on their loans at preferential rates and to reinvest their profits in maritime adventures or to buy back their own debt. A second form of association was to go into business with borrowed capital. In that case, merchants rented a ship from a wealthy owner, recruited the crew, and took on board traveling merchants from whom they charged a commission for their passage and the slots allocated to their goods. Other examples show that capital borrowed from wealthy families was used to buy goods that were sold abroad. Zhu Wan, a high-ranking official in Fujian province, says of former officials who went into business, I quote, "When they leave office and retire, they do not care about their reputation, but gather fugitives and rebels and develop a vast network of supporters. They terrorize the region and intimidate the officials. Merchants who go to sea and trade with foreign countries borrow their capital, their men and their ships. In all, they declare that they represent a certain high personage and they move without constraint. When a cargo is brought in, the original loan is first subtracted. The interest is as high as the original loan, and the rest of the booty is divided equally." Yet, apart from a few very wealthy merchants, who were often landowners, most merchants were small traders who had to join forces to embark on an overseas trade expedition. In a court case of the beginning of the 17th century, it appears that the sums received by the two ship owners came from the sharing of profit made after the sale of goods. They thus took a share from the profits. If there was no profit, there could not be levy, and in that case, the ship owner suffered a loss. This system was not very different from that practiced several centuries earlier under the Southern Song in the 12th century. It was a very old way of distributing profits with no significant legal advances. Partnerships were certainly attested as early as the Song in the case of maritime trade, and this formula had never perpetuated itself until the end of the 19th century. But it was not subject to improvement or legal refinement, as in the case of the Comenda. In the Mediterranean world, the legal separation of responsibilities between the owner and the manager had been achieved relatively early. Let me conclude. The nagging problem of China geopolitics during the 16th century was a lapidary observation. To the north, the barbarians of the steppe. To the south, the Japanese pirates. In fact, at the beginning of the 18th century, China saw its space bounded by two borders. An agrarian frontier in the north, well delimited and well controlled by the Manchus. It is marked by a systematic land clearing, but also by a complex strategy aiming at coaxing the steppe tribe to buy peace. Tea is exchanged for horses. And secondly, a maritime frontier in the south, very dynamic, moving with the expansion of merchants and beyond the control of the administration. China was able to close its border to just Dutch incursions, but could not prevent the flow of its subjects to the South Seas and their island territories. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Merci. Oui. Thank you, Francois. And now it's open to the floor. Zelina is the first one, of course, to respond.
Yeah.
Zelina, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I enjoyed very enormously your presentation, and I'm afraid I have missed your book. I will.
I will send it to you. Don't worry.
Don't say to me. You don't need to do that. We'll take it from after the library. Thank you anyway for this. The concept is wonderful, of course, and doing a couple of decades ago, I was working a lot on understanding the Mediterranean and Black Sea trade of the Greeks, and talking about entrepreneurial networks from the Eastern to Western to Western Europe. And I was very keen to compare the Greeks with the Jews, the Armenians, and then I found and of course with the Chinese. And I found a lot this kind of family businesses and very close networks. And I realized that the Chinese were very important in all the southeastern Asia, doing the diaspora Chinese. So I think there are many. The concept of the closed seas in the way of the Mediterranean, beyond borders, that continue to despite the states, despite the prohibitions, despite that there's continuously flows is marvelous. So I think we need to discuss more on this. I will get back to you after this seminar. Now concerning one of the things we talk about the sea, there are many big rivers, okay, which were very much, of course, controlled. So one of the things is that whether there is, I'm sure there was smuggling in there. But one of the things I wanted to discuss with you is this thing with piracy. Now, Chinese were famous pirates. And they were, from what I understand, of what I've read, there are dynasties of Chinese pirates. But these were, the question is, there is the kind of merchants that also do smuggling.
Yes.
And there is another group that are the thieves, the pirates. Okay. And from what I understand, there are many generations of this. So I just wanted to ask you first about this. I have many questions. I can't put them all, so monopolize completely, but I just wanted to start from this.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, as I mentioned, the frontier is very thin between regular merchants, smugglers, and pirates. And you have also text. I didn't mention that in my talk, but which relates very clearly the smuggling activities with the heavy regulation to foreign trade. So it goes, when regulation is soft, merchants are doing trade peacefully. When regulation is harder, honest merchants become smugglers, and smugglers can become pirate. But I wouldn't say that, well, it can be a very interesting point to discuss, that I cannot see a very clear-cut separation between smuggling and piracy. Because even I have an example in my sources of traders going to Southeast Asia, selling their goods, and coming back to China void, with the how do you say, the hold empty.
Yeah, empty.
And when the hold is empty, you can become very easily a pirate to have something to get back to your country. So you have expeditions with people selling ordinary goods to Southeast Asia, and on their way back, they encounter another ship and they just attack it to get something to bring back to their own country. So I think that in the whole East China Seas and Southeast Asian seas, the profession of pirate is very special and very different from what we have known pirates in, let's say, the Atlantic world.
If I may, Socrates, continue. For the Mediterranean, okay, you said you can have honest merchants that can turn into pirates, okay?
Yes.
On the other hand, the sea and the markets are not vast. So if you attack somebody from a neighboring town, he will find you in another port. So it's not so easy. So I think there must have been groups that acted continuously as pirates. And I'm just asking, you know, if there was this, and merchants that acted normal trade, but eventually also were able to act as pirates in a way. It's a very different, because I mean you cannot really act on maritime trade doing both for a long time, because they will find you.
Yeah. Okay. I see your point. The way to answer your question is to look at the administrative configuration of power in a huge empire where provinces like Fujian or Guangdong are out of reach of the central administration in Peking, and had traditionally developed a great tradition of rebellion, or at least autonomy. And you know, when you look at these port cities in Fujian province, some of them are completely out of the administrative scheme from coming from the up to down, so they can develop their own activities. And this is also the reason why for several decades Koxinga has been able to control vast territories in southern China, where he was able to raise taxes, to build ships, to gather products to be exported in Japan or Southeast Asia, and also to recruit, obviously, military people for putting on these ships. So it's a kind of huge organization which has its base in Taiwan until Taiwan was reconquered by the Manchu Empire in 1685. So let's say for about 40 years, you have this extraordinary example of a decent maritime empire in southern China. And Koxinga was also trying to involve the Japanese into the resistance to the Manchu, to the new Qing dynasty, but the Japanese very cautiously has said no. So he was isolated and in the end defeated. So, okay, you have merchants becoming smugglers and sometimes pirate, and you have also a huge pirate organization which was modeled, and this is what it is extremely interesting, it was modeled upon the organizational structure of the Ming administration. He had divided his empire into ministries with, it's incredible how much he was following the imperial model within another space in southern China.
Mhm. Okay, thank you.
But they nonetheless, I mean, those pirates who copied the imperial model, did they saw themselves as pirates or as a merchant confederation, as a state, or?
Well, at the beginning, they were considered themselves as rebels, as pirates. But then, when the Manchu began to conquer China, they saw themselves as faithful loyal to the Ming power. So they were embodied with a new kind of mission or responsibility, which was to defend Chinese empire against the invasion of foreigners.
Okay, so they were actually the heirs of the Ming, in a sense.
Yes, of course.
They had to play the game of imperial administration, in a sense.
Yes, yes. And the father of Koxinga, Zhang Zhelong, was at the beginning a successful merchant. Then he became a pirate. And when he was an extremely successful pirate, he was recruited by the Ming administration to be an admiral in the Ming Navy. So you have several examples in Chinese history of rebels bought by the power, offering them military responsibilities. They completely changed.
Can I ask, whom did they attack first? What were the prizes? And second, this China is not supposed to trade with anybody else, right? With the Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
What is the relation you said about Japanese pirates? Probably these were the merchants, smugglers, pirates.
Yes.
So was the trade that was flowing or was flourishing under this? So yeah, these two questions.
I didn't get excuse me. The first question was about?
The first question is, whom did these the Chinese pirates attack? What is his name? King. So who was the target?
Okay, but the target can be ordinary Chinese traders or sometimes Japanese, but most of the time the Chinese pirates attacked Chinese boats and Chinese ships. And the second question you mentioned is about the so-called Japanese pirate. This is very interesting because we had a real Japanese piracy, but much earlier in the 15th century. In 16th century, so-called Japanese pirates are in reality Chinese pirates, Philippines pirates, sometimes Korean pirates, but not Japanese.
Okay, right. So Japanese did not find a way to trade with China.
Japanese found a way to be included in tributary trade. Tributary trade was regulating foreign exchanges of the coast. So every 10 years, for instance, Okinawa or Ryukyu Islands were allowed to send an embassy with a lot of products to the Chinese kingdom. Malacca was also allowed every 4 years, or every country had a set time to send its embassy. So Japanese were involved in this, but they were also much more interested in direct trade and private direct trade, which has been able to develop in the 16th century. And they had a strong Chinese community established in Nagasaki, in the southern part of Japan, which was a kind of interface between China and Japan for organizing the business, the foreign trade.
I mean, European historiography says that it was only the Portuguese that were also in Nagasaki that were sort of doing the trade between Japan and China.
The Portuguese and then the Dutch were very active agent during the periods of maritime prohibitions. So the sequence is like that. You have tributary trade, but the tributary trade cannot prevent private traders to exchange with Japan or other Southeast Asian countries. So the reaction of the court is to decrete a ban on maritime trade. It's called maritime interdictions. The sea is closed. And during this period where the sea is closed, you have Portuguese communities, being it Macau or in Nagasaki, who are organizing from islands off the coast of Fujian, some exchange, or it was considered like smuggling points, in which you have Chinese traders and Japanese traders exchanging. So there were middlemen, there were arbitragists, there were very strong when China and Japan were separated by these maritime prohibitions.
I have a question for Caterina Galani. Is tributary trade the equivalent of the capitulatory regime in the Eastern Mediterranean? Do you know capitulations were given to France from Ottoman Empire and so on to certain merchants?
No,
states.
I'm sorry, I'm not able to answer this question since my knowledge is very limited to this, the practice of trade in the Eastern Mediterranean. I think tributary trade is a way of diffusing the international order conception of the Chinese court. It's not mainly about trade. It's mainly about diplomacy, international relations, and sometimes military issues. So
that's the same, actually, in a way.
Okay.
That's very actually can be similar, can be compared.
Okay. So it's an interesting, how do you say, bridge, an element of comparison between two different maritime areas, but functioning to some extent in a similar way. Yes, I was not aware of that. What I'm trying to work on now is the fact that there were a lot of exchanges also with foreigners, and these exchanges have not been made under the general assumption of aggression. No, it was connecting worlds. It was connecting practices. And in Japan, for instance, the commander has been integrated in Japanese way of doing maritime operations. But in the Chinese case, the commander form, which has appeared in the 12th century, about the same as in Italy, has never evolved into a more sophisticated legal instrument to facilitate trade. And for me, it's a big enigma. And I would like to continue to work on this. My hypothesis is that you have a strong development of law in China from the Tang and the Ming and so on, but it's mainly penal law. It's not private or commercial law. And this lack of a consistent, strong commercial legal apparatus has prevented China to develop other forms of business, which in the end have proved much more efficient. And it has been seen in the end, second half of the 19th century, when foreign traders arrived in Shanghai, established foreign concessions with extraterritoriality, and you have a lot of Chinese businessmen flocking into these areas because they wanted to be under the protection of the Anglo-Saxon private law and not submitted to the predatory behaviors of the local bureaucracy.
Mhm. That's pretty similar with many of the local traders as well in the with the Ottoman Empire. Yeah, we can. Shall I continue? So can I?
Yes, of course. I guess you should continue.
Yeah. Well, another very important question I have for you is important for me because we are now we're organizing a kind of workshop on insularity and maritime businesses and so on in the Mediterranean. In the Eastern Mediterranean, we have about 120 inhabited islands. Okay, out of these, 40 developed long-term trade. Okay, we're talking about the 18th and 19th century that we have thousands of voyages, so we have documentation on this, right? So the other 80, a large number of them were very big in fishing later in the 19th century, but generally and others in short distance trade. But we have these 40 deep sea going vessels. I was wondering, because there are many islands as well, okay, the Chinese coast.
Yes.
Are the maritime communities or the fleets or the big merchants and so on, or are there places that have developed particular skills in maritime trade and shipbuilding and shipping?
Well, to my knowledge, the extremely scattered, the great number of scattered islands off the coast of Fujian were mainly used as a repair for pirates, for smugglers during the sea prohibition period. I never heard of these places being important centers for fishing, for shipbuilding or other activity. This was concentrated on the coast, shipbuilding, and with very strong establishments. So
were they in the rivers?
Yes, they were also in the rivers, especially until Nanking, in the central part of China along the Blue River. But what strikes me is the fact that I would say Shuangyu, for instance, which was an island and a port or a pirate den, where the Portuguese was also very prominent, has been finally destroyed by the Chinese fleet in the mid 16th century. So you have the great autonomy of these operators at local level, and periodically you have military operations of the central administration to destroy pirates' den or centers for illegal Western activities off the coast of China.
Okay, that is the imperial fleet. I mean about merchant fleet.
The merchant fleets were operating there along this coast, but merchants' fleets were not organized as a fleet. They were organized as individual traders, and the fleet was the term, in my view, in the Chinese case, for either the pirates or the navy, the Ming or Qing navy.
Yeah, but where were the merchant were there any centers of merchant shipping?
Yes. Yes, you have ports like Zhengzhou or Xiamen or
So
Canton later.
it is mainly big ports, they're not small places.
Yes, big ports, yes.
Okay.
Big ports, but most of the time at the periphery and out of reach for the imperial administration at the beginning.
Okay.
Mm.
Okay.
As I was listening to you, about the difference between tributary trade, private trade, or smuggling piracy.
Yes.
And as you talked about the Atlantic world, as far as I know, from the time that Manila became Spanish, there's a strong flow of Spanish silver from Mexico to China and Japan. That would be an ideal price for any pirate, and for once it should have been the most valuable object that the imperial administration would try to protect. I know that silver flew to the China. I don't know how it arrived there. I don't know if it was out of a kind of excess foreign trade, or if it was simply bought as a merchandise. But I guess it must have been an important part of trade transport, which will be prized. Do you know anything about that? Do you have, just like the pirates in the Caribbean or in the Atlantic world, do you have pirates who are targeting silver flows? Are they protected by the Chinese or by the Spanish?
Okay, the main route for the Spanish silver from Acapulco or from Potosi to Manila was called the so-called galleon trade, Manila galleon trade. And if you have pirates attacks on this maritime road, it has been mainly done by the British, by the English privateers, not pirates. I never heard of pirates attack on a particular shipment of silver between Manila and China, because at the time silver entered China, but in a very scattered way, distributed in many ships doing business with Manila. And you have also strong Chinese Fukienese community in Manila acting as an intermediary between Fujian traders, Chinese traders, and the Spanish administration.
So in a sense, it was protected both by the states and by the networks.
It was protected by the structure of the network, which was extremely capillar between Manila and the Chinese coast, while it was highly concentrated between Mexico or Peru and the Philippines. But I never heard, because the Manila galleon system has last for more than 2 centuries, except 2 or 3 very spectacular attacks. I never heard of regular attacks of pirates on this road comparable to what happened in the Caribbean or in the Atlantic world.
I was thinking more of the trajectory from Manila to China.
To China, no.
That would be also a prize for the Japanese, whomever they were pirates, and of course for Dutch or Portuguese or whomever.
Yeah.
I mean, for real real pirates.
Yes, you have. Yes, you have attacks on this leg of the route, but it can be not specifically, how do you say, aimed at silver. It can be aimed at silk, at a lot of very precious products that the Chinese were transporting at that time, including sugar, because it seemed that the Japanese were not mastering the technology of refining sugar, but only the Chinese at that time. You have Japanese fruits imported in China. You have many very precious goods that were subject to attacks also. Not specifically silver, but because silver entered in a huge quantity in China during the 16th century, but it has also other effects.
Yeah.
Wasn't it the silk trade? I'm sorry, it was mainly silk trade, silk from China,
yes,
to the with the Manila galleons, and this way it went to Spain.
yes.
So that was an incredible trip. Yeah.
Yes, silk and porcelain also.
And porcelain, yeah.
Yeah.
It went the other way.
Yes.
Came back, but with the silver, but
Yeah.
and it's a very difficult. It was one of the most killing trips. I mean, I think how many? I think 2/3 of or 1/3 at least of the crews were dead, and also it took a lot of months to go back. So I don't think that the pirates would survive in the Pacific.
Katerina Galani. Katerina, Marcus.
Hi, hello.
Hello.
Sorry for the absence of the video. I'm sorry to digress from what you talked about today, but it falls within your broader topics of the book. So excuse me for the other participants. I was wondering, let's go to the 19th century and the era of industrialization and the steam. Could you please comment on how these ports, the Southeast Asian ports, interact and reinvent themselves with the steam during the steam period? Do we see ports becoming imperial ports, national ports, international ports? How do they reinvent themselves, and how do they work together or compete with one another?
Thank you for your question. Well, the focus of the book was not specifically on this part of the 19th century economic history, but what is striking is that in the first and also in the second half of this century, these Southeast Asian ports were organizing a huge current of migration to the new worlds and to the America, to also Latin America. And this has been obviously organized by existing overseas Chinese communities in Jakarta, in Manila, in Malaysia, in Vietnam also. So this is, in my view, what I'm seeing in this period of time, and with these the ports you mentioned. I don't know if you.
Thank you.
I'm fine, thanks.
Okay, and Nikos Potamianos, you can have the floor, Nico.
Hello, thank you for your lecture. I have a question out of complete ignorance. I mean, the Chinese diaspora is well known, but I don't know what happens with other diasporas in the area. I mean, is there a Japanese, a Filipino, Korean diaspora? If not, it is because Chinese are, bigger and more powerful in terms of economic power. Are there any demographic factors for this?
Well, except the Chinese immigration, which started very early in Southeast Asia. In the 12th century, you have Chinese migrants coming to the Nanyang. except from this very well-known and visible immigration, you have also, on a much smaller scale, immigration of Japanese in the Philippines and in Siam. And but it's not completely clear. It seems to be linked with the persecution of Christians in Japan in the mid-17th century. And these people were samurai, were highly trained military people, and they were acting as guards for the Philippine administration or the Siamese government also. So this is the only other example in my to my knowledge of diasporas in Asia. Of course, you have also internal migration among the Indonesian archipelago, and you have clans of Bugis or Muslim traders moving from one island to another and controlling this part of this segment of trade. And obviously, you have that also in Hong Kong, with a lot of Indian diasporas, sometimes competing with each other. So I don't think that this cosmopolitan world has, well, I think this cosmopolitan world is made of very different diasporas, not necessarily interacting with each other.
Can I add to that? There must be, you mentioned as well, the Parsis. Okay.
Yes, yes.
And also Baghdadi Jews.
Yes.
Are also in Hong Kong,
yes.
I think.
Yes.
I mean, I think some soon, you know, even the Vidal Sassoon, you know.
Yes, Sassoon, of course.
Very,
of course.
And so you have, you're very right. It's you have a lot of diasporas that, yeah, they do not communicate, but I think here we've missed the point. I think they do collaborate on a certain level, but we don't know how much. Maybe. Yeah.
The Baghdadi Jews were very active. Baghdadi Jews is a generic term for Jews from the Middle East in Asia. So they were extremely active in Shanghai in the second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And you have also you mentioned the Parsi merchants, Parsi from Bombay. If we look back at the opium trade in China, it's often said that it was implemented by Scots or British people, but in reality, it was the Parsi merchants who were like the pilots for the British in order to open up the Chinese market for opium. And the Parsis was extremely aggressive at the commercial and financial level, because I've seen some documents in which the British merchants operating in Canton with the Parsi tried to calm down the Parsi merchants, because they said, if you continue to lend money to our Chinese counterpart at such a high rate of interest, we won't have any merchants, clients anymore. So Parsi were extremely aggressive in lending to the continuously indebted Chinese merchants in Canton.
Yeah, and these were very, very closed. They were not, very,
but when I say that these community, okay, you can understand these trading networks as, let's say, cosmopolitan communities. Okay, it's cosmopolitan as a general picture, but when you look at every network, they are extremely. There is no, how do you say, wedding among these different networks. They are not doing business with each other. It's not passive. It's a highly competitive world.
Yes, it's true. It's true.
Yes, they have to keep their world separate in order to have a world.
Yes.
Otherwise, they would not be diasporas or something. So.
Yes.
You have on the one hand the European chartered companies from all the European countries, and then on the East Indian companies and so on. And on the other hand, you have the diaspora communities that do a kind of an official sort of network and trade. Yeah, it's very interesting. But yeah, it's
before maybe Justin, something that you said before, I think that you said that a pirate could become an admiral, so that there was policy. This, I mean, in a sense, when somebody is able to administer violence, administer people, and administer things, he can become an administrator of the state. It's not very, I mean, in the Ottoman Empire, you usually have people who are thought of as eskiya, as bandits, who end up, of course, as military officers, as passers. So, and then they can also be called bandits because they broke with the Sultan and the law. So, in a sense, if you administer violence and power, you are more or less a possible recruit for the imperial administration. I was wondering whether this is also the case in China. I mean, if I understand well, mandarins, provincial landowners, capital owners are somehow a kind of leading elite. But probably there's also one part which is the specialist of power, of violence.
Yes.
Those that can administer violence and control roads. And I guess in this sense, pirates are a part of the administration which is out of business in a sense. I mean,
Yes.
It will be very much Middle Eastern and Ottoman, and not only Ottoman probably. And I don't know about the Indian world really, but one can say that you can be an independent entrepreneur of violence, looking probably for a new employer. I mean, you can be a broker or a banker yourself.
Yes. No, I think it's an extremely relevant remark. What I've seen is in the case, for instance, of escort companies working with silver transfer from inner provinces of China to the central capital. There is a lot of porosity between bandits and guards, and sometimes guards are recruiting bandits because, as you say, they have an expertise in violence, and they are in expertise in military skills, so they can be very good candidates for being recruited as guards. And it has been also a very ancient tradition to try to corrupt rebel leaders and to offer them some position within the power structure in order to circumvent their capability to do evil.
Thank you, Francois.
Thank you very much to you.
If there is nothing more, Zelina,
I have a lot more, but I think
you can ask them. You have.
We need to meet. I will.
Okay. It's pleasure.
But let's give a rendezvous probably in May.
Yeah.
Or somehow another way.
Okay. With
We're organizing. We're organizing something in October, so we have to discuss Socrates.
Okay.
So either in May or in October, Francois. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you all of you.
Very much.
And have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, François.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mes salutations à Maurice.
Merci. J'y manquerai
Au revoir.
pas.
beaucoup.
Merci. Au revoir.
Yes, yes.
Ça,